One of the many cliffhangers A Song of Ice and Fire fans have been left with for the last 13 years is Cersei's trial by combat. At the end of Feast, Cersei attempts to get Margaery put on trial by the Faith for adultery, by sending her stooge Osney Kettleblack to the Faith to claim he slept with her. However, everything goes wrong when the Faith gets suspicious, do a little bit of light torture, and quickly get Osney to tell him that in fact Cersei has been sleeping with him, and that she had him kill the previous High Septon. Combine that with Lancel's testimony, and Cersei quickly winds up in a cell, where she ends up confessing to adultery with Lancel and all three Kettleblacks, and is punished with a walk of shame. Despite this, she's still accused of other crimes, ones for which saying sorry isn't enough, according to the Faith. Most likely killing the previous High Septon, and sleeping with Jaime and Moonboy for all I know. For those, there must be a trial, and though Cersei could choose a regular, good old-fashioned theocratic trial, she knows she wouldn't stand a chance, unlike Margaery, whom the Faith seems slightly more inclined to believe, and may end up opting for a normal trial. For Cersei, the only option is a trial by combat, which is unfortunate as tradition dictates that as Queen Mother she has to be defended by one of the Kingsguard. Initially this means she has to rely on the old and mediocre Boros Blount and Meryn Trant, the only two available members of the Kingsguard, which is fitting justice as it was the same ploy she was going to use against Margaery. However, in Dance it's revealed to Cersei that Aerys Oakheart is dead, and a replacement can be made. Qyburn introduces us to that replacement, Robert Strong, at the very end of Cersei's second and last chapter in Dance. Whether or not Robert Strong is a zombie Frankenstein's monster version of the Mountain as everyone suspects, or just a new guy, he's 8 feet tall and built like a truck, so it's safe to say he'll be Cersei's pick over Boros and Meryn when it comes to a trial. The question we'll be looking to answer today is, who will Rob Zombie fight? I trolled through a few Reddit threads before this, and there's a lot of names that get thrown around, so I won't cover every possibility here. In fact, despite the runtime of this video, I'm not actually going to cover many of them, but we'll look at some of the most likely. Before we get going, we should remember who is choosing the champion who will face off against Red Shoe over here. The trial is being run by the Faith, and that means it's being run by the High Sparrow. When you're dealing with religious zealots in A Song of Ice and Fire, you can get some pretty crazy characters who will take decisions that might seem pretty irrational to someone that doesn't share their zeal. I'm thinking Aeron, Melisandre, Baelor the Blessed, and so on. Will the High Sparrow do something crazy, like put forward Resident Noodle Arm Lancel Lannister, believing that with the gods behind him he can't lose? Well, probably not. The High Sparrow is a savvy political operator, after all. If you look at his conversation with Cersei where he convinces her to let the Faith rearm, he's willing to bend the traditions of the Faith in order to get what he wants, essentially threatening to filibuster Tommen's coronation unless Cersei throws him a bone, which he duly gets with the reformation of the Faith Militant, an absolutely massive victory. He's wise enough not to overly antagonise the Tyrells, who have an army in the city, and he captures Cersei using deception after seeing right through the Osney plan. The High Sparrow may or may not be the pious paragon he pertains to be, he may or may not be Renner for Longwaters, but what we know is that he isn't going to do something stupid just because he thinks the gods will bail him out. With that in mind, who are our likely candidates to fight our good friend Bobby B. Smith? While in theory the High Sparrow could ask anyone to do it, the only ones who are going to be willing to fight the Mountain are other members of the Faith, who either think the gods will rig it for them or are too pious to turn down the High Sparrow. Of course, it could turn out that Qyburn's zombie magic is mostly smoke and mirrors, and Robert Strong will die hilariously easily, but from what little we've seen of him, that seems unlikely. Of the named fighters affiliated with the Faith, the character we know best is probably Lancel Lannister, who I mentioned earlier. He'd probably be mental enough to do it, but the High Sparrow, as we discussed, wouldn't be mental enough to let him, as he starved himself near to death after having a horrible injury at the Blackwater. Besides Lancel, we know Bonifer Hasty, who captains the Holy Hundred, a band of extremely religious warriors. He's old and currently the Castellan of Harrenhal, but would probably be up for it if the High Sparrow asked him, and if he died it would be another notch on the bedpost for the curse of Harrenhal. But Bonifer, even if he does have Dark Sister, would still have pretty long odds against everyone's favourite Cranberry song. The best man the Faith have is probably Theoden Wells. Who? Yeah, even in the most obsessive of Ice and Fire circle jerks, there are a few who know who Theoden Wells is. He was introduced in A Feast for Crows as the captain of the reformed Warriors' Sons, a band of religious warriors, and escorts Cersei to her trial. He's probably the most logical choice for the High Sparrow, though he isn't described as being so impressive you'd think he'd have a chance against the Mountain. Of course, the big problem is that he isn't described at all. If I knew anything about boxing, I'd make a boxing analogy here, but I don't. So Theoden Wells versus the Mountain is like if Muhammad Ali went up against that bloke down the pub who always tells everyone he just missed out on going pro. The trials by combat we've seen so far in the story have escalated massively in scale and substance. The first one was Bronn versus Vardis Egan, a sellsword we didn't really know that well against a knight who'd only just been introduced. The second was the Mountain, a well-known and well-hated character to the audience, versus Oberyn Martell, a charismatic and likeable rogue, the brother of the Prince of Dawn and one of the top 10 fighters in Westeros. The third is the Mountain resurrected as a zombie versus Theoden Wells. Understandably, fans feel that there must be someone else in store, someone else who would actually be willing to fight Nick Frost. Someone who, like Oberyn, hates the Mountain with a deep and terrible passion, and who would love nothing more than the chance to kill him, without much care about what the trial is actually about. You all know who I'm talking about. Nymeria Sand. Yeah, this is one of the ones I found when looking through Reddit, and it's the one of those that I like the most. At the end of the books, Lady Nym is on her way to King's Landing to take up Doran Martell's seat on the small council. If she gets there in time for the trial, she may volunteer to fight the Mountain just as Oberyn did. She is said to be good with knives and poisons, so she might fancy her chances if she can get a good stab in. And it's telling that she's the one who points out how if someone 8 feet tall appears, they'll all know it's the Mountain, setting her up for an accidental fight with one of Duncan the Tall's many descendants. But although Nymeria Sand is dangerous, it's more in a poison your food and stab you in the back way than a trial by combat way. She might be better than anyone the Faith puts forward, but against the Mountain, especially when the reader knows her poisons probably won't work against him and a little knife won't do much either, she's still very much the underdog. Speaking of dogs, I suppose it's finally time we talk about the Hound. If you don't know the Gravedigger theory, the long and short of it is that Sandor Clegane is still alive and living in a religious commune on the Quiet Isle. The evidence for him being chosen for the trial can essentially be boiled down to 1. He's the Hound, so he's pretty strong. 2. He's with the Faith right now, so maybe the High Sparrow knows where he is and that he's still alive. And 3. Clegane Bowl, get hype. Let's party like it's 2015. The evidence against is pretty powerful though. Even if you exclude all the English literature peel paragraph narrative reasons for him staying where he is. 1. He's pretty badly injured, and that happened fairly recently. 2. It's not like the Faith have a hive mind, unlike some other religions I could mention, and the Quiet Isle is pretty remote, so it's unlikely the High Sparrow would have heard about him, even if the Elder Brother wanted to tell him, which seems unlikely. And 3. He's currently a wanted criminal, not just for desertion, but also some pretty horrific atrocities that were actually done by Rouge while wearing his helmet, which makes it unlikely that the Sparrows are going to welcome him in with open arms. Remember, the driving force for the Sparrow movement is things like the bloody mummers burning down sects and all that stuff. So the High Sparrow is looking at a pretty shoddy list of candidates right now. If Reddit is to be believed, anyone from Jaime Lannister to the Blackfish to John Connington could be on the roster, but they can all be fairly easily written off with the simple questions how and why. Yet we've run into the problem the High Sparrow is facing. It doesn't really matter who he puts up against Vorian's Scapegrace, even if he had the entire continent to call upon. Robert Strong beats pretty much all of them. So why is he even going ahead of a trial if he's doomed to lose? Well, when he moved against Cersei, the only possible opponents were Boris Blount and Meryn Trant, so it seemed like a good idea at the time. Robert Strong was only introduced right at the end of Cersei 2: A Dance with Dragons, so we haven't yet seen how the High Sparrow has reacted to him, or what he's plotting to try and tip the scales back in his favour. Before I go down a speculative rabbit hole to try and find out what his move's going to be, I'd like to just say one more thing. This series is full of twists and turns. Things are set up to make it look like they'll go one way and then they go another. It's a way of keeping us on the edge of our seats, of keeping the action engaging. The fight between Oberyn and the Mountain in Tyrion's trial is a great example of this. Beforehand, the Mountain is the favourite. As they watch, it starts to look like Oberyn might win it, then it looks like he's won, then, spoiler alert, he hasn't. We've already had a bunch of these twists with the trial plot. Cersei trying to frame Marjorie, then it being reversed on her by the High Sparrow, and putting her in a desperate situation, then Qyburn pulling Robert Strong out of his arse to flip it round so that now the High Sparrow is the one scrambling for a response. This is King's Landing, remember, this is the political plot. Scheming and one-upmanship and people sitting back and saying, your move, is what this is all about. So with that mindset, what might the High Sparrow do to counter Robert Strong? Well, the High Sparrow does everything by sevens, and if he wants to level the playing field a bit, he could demand a trial by 7. A trial by 7 is a trial by combat where there's 7 people on both sides. We've seen 2 in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe, Duncan the Talls in the Hedge Knight and Maegor the Cruel's in Fire and Blood. In both cases it's the accuser who can demand a trial by 7, so it is in the High Sparrow's power to do so. The trial by 7 is beneficial in 2 ways, religious and practical. You might have noticed that the Faith of the Seven thing is a bit obsessed with the number 7. 7 gods, 7 hells, the symbol is a 7-pointed star, which is also the name of the holy book. The religious buildings are called the septs, and priests are called septons and scepters, like Septagon has 7 sides. They often go around in groups of 7, like here with the old High Septon having 7 septons and 77 scepters. I'm pretty sure it's a Harry Potter spell. At a coronation, the High Sparrow has to pray for 7 days and 7 nights, and anoint the king with 7 oils. Joffrey's wedding feast has 77 courses, and Tommen's has 7. The list goes on endlessly. and the High Sparrow is remarked upon as being especially numerological, even by these ludicrous standards, so he must be off the chain. Oh, and if you need any more evidence, Maegor's trial by 7 was demanded by the captain of the Warriors' Sons, an arm of the Faith militant, and all of the 7 that fought Maegor were Warriors' Sons fanatics. Even if the High Sparrow himself is Richard Dawkins in disguise and doesn't actually believe any of this rubbish, he knows it will make the trial even more legitimate in the eyes of the god-drunk masses. Then there's the practical benefits. A normal guy, even someone as presumably competent as Theoden Wells or Nymeria Sand, doesn't stand much chance against Rob Zombie. But if you have 7 normal people against 6 normal people and 1 8-foot tall abomination, you make it a little bit more of a fair fight. And finally, there's a narrative reason, that it's another twist, the High Sparrow's response to Cersei's move, and it's the way to make this an escalation on the previous 2 trials by combat, and make it more interesting to the reader by making it less obvious who's going to win. So practically, religiously, narratively, the trial by 7 makes sense as the next step. Who will Robert Strong fight then? Well, probably a mix of all the candidates we discussed. Theoden Wells is probably a shoo-in, and I think Nymeria Sand will probably be in there too. Lancel, Bonifer and Sandor are a bit longer shots, if for no other reason than, even in a 7v7, the side with Rob Zombie on it will be the favourite, and High Sparrow is going to have to find some pretty good fighters to counter him. Or at least, that would be the case. But perhaps the High Sparrow has another trick up his sleeve. You see, Cersei will hear about the trial by 7 and initially think it's a pretty weak play, until someone tells her an important stipulation in the rules. If you can't find 7 people to fight for you, then you lose by default and are declared guilty. In both previous trials by 7 we know about, this has been a factor. In Dunk's, the trial by 7 was specifically chosen by Aerion Brightflame because he didn't think Dunk could get the numbers, and when the Faith demand a trial of 7 against Maegor, none of his Kingsguard are around, so he has to call for volunteers from the audience, and initially no one speaks up. So maybe the Faith were hoping that he wouldn't get the numbers and lose on a technicality. The High Sparrow might be trying this tactic again. So can Cersei get the numbers? Remember the situation she's in. Everyone hates her. The common people, the Tyrells, the other Lannisters, the Faith, even her own small council abandoned her. If you fight for her, even if you win, she's going to have her political power stripped from her, so you won't get much out of it. And given how much everyone hates her, you might just get ripped apart by an angry mob anyway. The only people who would agree to fight for her are those who have literally no other option. Either they're duty-bound to, or it's the only alternative to something even worse. Alongside Robert Strong, she can call on Boros Blount and Meryn Trant, who won't be able to refuse her if they want to stay Kingsguard and, more importantly, alive. But beyond them, who else? You might think there'll be some young desperados, free riders, warriors looking for glory, the Knights of Summer who'll risk it all just for a chance to show off. And there are characters like that in King's Landing. The trouble is Cersei had them all arrested for sleeping with Marjorie. Lambert Turnberry, Hugh Clifton, Bayard Norcross, Mark Mullendore, Tallard the Tall. They're not likely to help her out now, even if they're allowed to. Perhaps they will end up fighting in trials to determine their own innocence, but seeing as the crime they're accused of is separate, it would have to be a separate trial. No, if some knights are going to fight for Cersei solely to clear their names, they'll have to be the ones who are implicated in the same crime. The Kettleblacks. Osmond and Osfrid are both currently held by the Crown, and are protesting their innocence of the adultery which Cersei already confessed and did her Walk of Atonement for. Kevin tells us that the Kettleblacks will either have to confess and go to the wall, or fight a trial by combat against Robert Strong. Neither prospect will be appealing to the knights, so if they are instead given the chance to fight alongside Rob Zombie against a bunch of religious nerds, they would fancy their chances. The Faith already has Cersei's confession, but the fact that a trial was still on the card shows that the Kettleblacks still have a chance to prove their innocence. And remember, in Dunk's trial it was pretty obvious what he'd done. Everyone knew he'd kicked the shit out of Aerion Brightflame, but he was still allowed a trial. If that right is afforded to some lowborn hedge knight, then the Kettleblacks should also be able to claim it. And if you're gonna have Osmond and Osfrid in there, surely you've got to get Osney in too, right? He's a bit trickier to work into the theory, I'll grant you, given that he's already confessed to all his crimes and is being held by the Faith. The Dunk precedent that you can still be obviously guilty and not even trying to deny it but still get a trial is helpful here. But if the whole Faith plan is to make sure Cersei loses on the technicality of not getting enough people, it doesn't really make sense if they let Osney fight for her. Of course, he's pretty badly injured from all the torture, so he won't be much use in the actual fight, but even so, the High Sparrow wouldn't want to take his chances. He'd only let Osney go if he was absolutely certain that she couldn't get a 7th person to fight for her. But you could forgive him for thinking that. Robert Strong is a zombie, Boros Blount and Meryn Trant are contractually obligated to defend Cersei's honour, the 3 Kettleblacks are her co-defendants. If you don't fit into one of those 3 camps, why would you risk your life for her? If news is arriving in King's Landing about Stannis taking Winterfell or Aegon taking Storm's End, who would bet everything on Cersei coming out on top and rewarding them for their service, especially when they see what's happened to all her previous allies? Who would be fool enough to fight for Cersei? Hang on. Fool enough? Cersei doesn't need a brave and noble knight to be her 7th champion. She just needs a warm body to make up the numbers. If anyone with more than 2 brain cells to rub together won't do that, she'll just have to find someone without. And the only person we know of who fits into that category is in King's Landing and is already in service to the crown, is Moonboy. So there's the next twist in the story. We'll probably see the trial through Cersei's perspective, like we saw Tyrion through his. We'll see the 7 of the Faith, Theoden Wells, Nymeria Sand, Bonifer Hasty, Lancel Lannister, 2 other randomers and a mysterious, limping, hooded figure. They'll go up against Cersei's 7, Robert Strong dressed in his Faith armour, Boros Blount and Meryn Trant looking fat and slow as ever, the Kettleblacks all in various states of decay from torture and imprisonment, and Moonboy probably doing some cartwheels for the benefit of the audience. The reader isn't sure who will win. Both sides are such motley crews with such a range of abilities and in such a range of conditions that it's hard to call. And that's exactly why the High Sparrow doesn't want to leave this to chance. Right from the start he must have known that Cersei might be able to find enough people to field a team, even if she had to scrape the bottom of the barrel for the last couple. He needed a contingency plan if the technicality option failed. Or perhaps that was a feint all along, concealing his real strategy. Because the High Sparrow is a religious leader. He sees day in, day out the power that religion holds over people. He also knows that a lot of his presentation. He knows this from the opulent style of his predecessors and his own deliberately ascetic approach. He knows that this is the first trial of 7 in the century, probably, and that the atmosphere is going to be electric with religion. The onlookers seeing the massive frame of Robert Strong, and then looking at his opponents, among them a woman, a cripple, a noodle arm, and an old man, will realise with a sinking feeling that the faith will need a miracle to win. And the High Sparrow plans to deliver that miracle. You see, allowing the Kettleblacks to fight for Cersei means that the High Sparrow has free agents on the enemy team. If he offers them a pardon, he can get them to do anything he likes. Add to that Boros Blount, who is known to frequent the Street of Silk, so the High Sparrow likely has dirt on him as well. Meryn Trant doesn't care about anything. No scruples will hold him back from doing something dishonourable if it means a quiet life, just like how he beat Sansa on Joffrey's command. And Moonboy? Well, Moonboy is the key to all this. Sansa thinks that even though everyone thinks he's an idiot, he can't be because he's so witty. If he signed up to fight for Cersei, it's not because he's too stupid to know the danger, it's because he's the High Sparrow's man on the inside. Moonboy often mocks the previous High Septons for being fat, and is the one who comes up with the name High Sparrow for the current High Septon. Maybe a mockery to the ears of the nobles, but the High Sparrow is playing to a different gallery, the Commons, and to them this says that he is one of their own. It distinguishes him from all the other High Septons, who remember are not allowed to have any other name. And of course, if Moonboy does something to help the High Sparrow, nobody's going to think it's part of some grand conspiracy, because he's Moonboy, too stupid to be involved in something like that. And if it's not a conspiracy, then it must be a miracle. And what will the miracle be? Well, when the horn is blown and the fight begins, only Robert Strong will step forward. The other 6 champions on Cersei's side will fall to their knees, lie prostrate on the ground, start speaking in tongues, throw their arms to the air. Cersei will watch in horror and confusion, as one by one they turn to her and denounce her. They will declare that they have seen a sign from the 7 themselves, that she is guilty of the crime she is accused of, and in good conscience they cannot fight for her, but instead must fight against her. The crowd will be amazed at this defection among the ranks that are presumably the favourites. Maybe the High Sparrow has deliberately picked a pretty miserable 7, with Lancel, Sandor and Bonifer, and maybe even throwing in some old fat Septons like Lucian or Reynard, to make it clear who should win, and so make it even more miraculous that 6 of Cersei's champions chose to switch sides. And of course, Moonboy, speaking in full sentences of the glory of the 7, will be the biggest proof of them all. This is a miracle, a sign from the gods that Cersei is guilty. The High Sparrow will have revealed a powerful play that Cersei did not see coming. The bishop will take the queen. But the fight is not over yet. There is perhaps one more twist in this tale. Robert Strong now faces 13 opponents, arranged in a circle around him. Even for a man 8 feet tall, to win such a battle would be an impossible feat. He might take 1 or 2 down with him, but at the end of the day he is doomed to die. Any other outcome would be a miracle. The 13 are initially nervous, wary of being on the end of the one good swing Robert Strong will get in before he dies. Rob Zombie strikes first then, cleaving Septon Lucian in half with his greatsword, but before he can pull it free they are on him, stabbing and hacking at the gaps in his armour, cutting deep into his flesh. He should be dead already, but then what they don't know, of course, is that he is dead already. The cuts and stabs mean little to him. He sweeps the attackers away with his colossal arms, pulls the greatsword free, and begins slaughtering them. As they realise the hopelessness of the situation they're in, some of them try to run, some fall to their knees and plead for mercy, some try to face him down. None of it works. Robert Strong will stride forth, the 7-pointed stars gleaming on his shoulders, the 7 plumes of the rainbow standing proud on his great helm, and the onlookers will watch with amazement. The miracle of the conversion is forgotten at once. Here is a true miracle, a man given superhuman strength by the gods. Cersei will be just as surprised as the rest, watching as her luck turns. The High Sparrow 40 had checkmate, but Robert Strong has flipped the board. 12 will lay dead and dying, as Robert Strong faces down his final opponent, the hooded, limping stranger. There may be a bit of back and forth, a good fight put up by the hooded man, but this is a zombie. It has no need of a grave for him to dig. As Robert Strong's greatsword cuts into his flesh, all he can do is lash out with all his strength, knocking the 8-foot-tall man's helmet from his shoulders. And Cersei will gasp along with the crowd at what is revealed. Maegor became a horrendous resurrected zombie after being the last man standing in his trial, but the last man standing in this one is already there. Behind the great helm, there is nothing but thick black blood. And so the final twist in the story will see Cersei's debauchery revealed. Who knows logistically what happens next, how they deal with Robert Strong, who might survive their injuries among the 13. But one thing is for certain. Cersei has employed a demon on her side in the most holy of holy trials. She is damned for all eternity, and her reign as queen and her life are over. So there you go, that's my little theory about who Robert Strong will fight. Let me know what you think in the comments, and whether or not you think this is an April Fool's joke. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.